Welcome to Let's Talk Transportation, a podcast series of the Broward Metropolitan Planning Organization, also known as the MPO. We talk about the ins and outs of transportation in Broward County and all of Southeast Florida, why it matters, how it works, and the challenges and opportunities related to achieving great transportation. I'm your host, Greg Stewart, Executive Director of the MPO. I'm joined today by
Joe Yesbeck with TYLin International.
Welcome, Joe. It's great having you here today.
Thanks, Greg.
So, as I was mentioning to you before we started, this is about an oral history of Southeast Florida, the transportation network, and this is where we've grown up. You want to talk a little bit about growing up here as a child and things that influenced you to ultimately end up at TYLin?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Greg. Yeah, I was born and raised in Miami. I'm a native South Floridian. And when I grew up in the area that's now Little Havana, when I was a kid, back in the 60s is when what's now the Dolphin Expressway was actually being built just a few blocks from my house. And I was just captivated by what was going on in the construction of this road and how it was changing the community. And that, I would say, is what triggered my early interest in being involved in transportation. I always knew from then on I was going to get into civil engineering and get into transportation.
So did you know it was civil engineering initially? Because my parents said, oh, you should be an architect.
No, yeah, I knew because my dad told me. I asked him, hey, who decides where the roads get built? And he told me those are civil engineers. Plus, my dad went to school to be an architect, and he kind of shied me away from that.
I didn't. I wish I had. Yeah. So, bigger picture. So, as you saw the Dolphin Expressway get built, I guess you got to see a little bit of what we used to call, when I was a kid, Spaghetti Junction down there, and the equity issues that happened with Overtown and that. Did that spar anything with your as a child as well?
I would say later on, when I went away to college, I went to Georgia Tech, which was known at the time for having a strong practice in traffic engineering. So my interest in transportation got very focused on traffic engineering because of college. So I was fortunate when I graduated to come back and get a job at Florida DOT in the traffic operations office, which is, for me, was exactly where I wanted to be. So I really, early on, was focused more on traffic engineering and the problems at intersections on roadways. But that's where I started to see that really the problems of moving people and how roadways can affect communities were bigger than just an intersection. It was,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that expansion that you got to see while working, do you start with District 6 or District 4?
District 4.
District 4 up here in Broward.
Yeah.
That's actually awesome. So, when you started there, I guess there was 595 even there at the time?
595 had just completed its the environmental study. In fact, a gentleman, Rick Chesser, was the project manager who oversaw getting the EIS approved. And when that was done, he moved from that position to become the head of traffic operations, or my boss. And so 595 during the 80s was really a time of right-of-way acquisition where they started to acquire the right-of-way. So when I started, it was just State Road 84, which was a 2-lane road. And you look at 595 now and think, wow, in just 30, 40 years,
I have those flashback moments where when I'm actually looking at something, I'm actually seeing what I remember as a kid, that like you're saying, State Road 84 with ditches on both sides, going out to the Kapok tree and the restaurant that was out there at the time. But if you think about what you got to see and how 595 got developed, that was a lot of vision from the 1972 land use plan. We still have a copy online. That was actually called the Port Everglades Expressway. No one knew what that was either. It was just like, how did that road get there and how did that plan happen? So with Rick Chesser and you working on that project, do you know anything? Remember the city of Hacienda Village?
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, those of us who are residents of Broward before the 90s knew that when you went on State Road 84 through Hacienda Village, which is around 441, US 441, you always slowed down and went about 2 miles below the speed limit because, for a town that had about 30, 40 residents, it had an equal number of officers that were out there ticketing. So, and 595, you may remember, Greg, bought the entire village.
Yeah, and that actually took care of that problem?
That problem disappeared. They bought the village, the legislature decertified the village, and that was it. It was all gone.
You wonder if during the time many of the legislators actually had tickets from there, too.
Everyone at one point or another had a ticket from there.
It's kind of the irony of life when and again, like I see it, I remember it, and you're driving on 595, I go, out to visit my in-laws a lot out in Southwest Ranches, and you just go, wow, there used to be this city here, and I remember that, and I remember slowing down, and now no one will ever remember that. Yeah. Again, that goes to the point of why I do this podcast. I want to actually have these things in people's minds that way they can, they may not necessarily be able to visualize it, but they can hear it in our voices. It was actually a reality.
Well, when you mentioned about 595 being originally the Port Everglades Expressway, it actually was supposed to be a tolled expressway. And so a little piece of useless trivia is when you go through the interchange of 595 and the Turnpike, all the ramps come together at one point. That's not because of the efficiency of design. That's where the toll booth was supposed to be. And then when it moved, awesome. So that's why all the ramps come together at one point. It was supposed to be a toll booth, but when it went from a tolled expressway to a freeway, they just removed the toll booth but kept the roadway design the same.
So was it going to be part of the interstate highway system, or was it going to be part of there was a Broward County Expressway?
It was part of the expressway program, but what happened is that DOT with Rick Chesser and Broward County was successful in getting it added to the what was called the Interstate Cost to Complete Plan, which the Federal Highway Administration maintained. So by getting it added to the interstate system, that made it eligible for interstate funding.
The irony, another irony with that too, if you kind of think about it, is now there's a toll lane in the middle.
That's true.
so now it's like gone full circle in a way. But it, that helped it build faster, because it's like now, 15, 20 years ahead of schedule. Absolutely. It'd probably be under construction as we're speaking right now if it wasn't for that toll facility.
And who knows what the cost, construction as well as just right-of-way acquisition would be.
Waiting that many more years.
In today's dollars.
Eventually we're going to have Rick on and have some conversations with him. I'm looking forward to that. But so what other projects did you get to see happen down here?
Well, the big project for me, which was in the mid 80s, I was taught when I mentioned earlier about traffic engineering, and I got to the point where I just wanted to try to be part of something bigger. And being at DOT, there was this concept of possibly starting a commuter rail system here in Southeast Florida. And the MPO, along with the Miami-Dade, and Broward and Palm Beach MPOs had put together a tri-county committee. It was an informal committee to oversee a study to look at the possibility of adding commuter rail. So FDOT agreed to do an environmental study. And they needed a project manager. And so I moved and said, that sounds pretty interesting. And it changed, that one project changed the arc of my career, and I think made a significant contribution to transportation mobility here in Southeast Florida and Broward. That the beauty of that project was the environmental, the EIS, the environmental assessment was approved in 1987.
Wow.
It was operational in January of 1989. It was stunning how quickly that project went from concept to operation. It was less than 5 years that whole project went from just a glint in somebody's eye to actually operating.
So that was when Tri-Rail was born.
That's when Tri-Rail was born.
And that was my memory of that was also the widening of I-95. They went from 6 lanes, I think, to
when they added the carpool lanes and the extra auxiliary lanes. Yeah, 6 to 10, 6 to 12 lanes.
That was actually a good investment for down here, and even with tri-rail operations on the West Track. So when the original study was done by the MPOs, was it to look at the FEC or the CSX tracks?
Well, the original study the intent was to look at both corridors.
Okay.
But at the time, the FEC's leadership was still the same leadership that had been in place in the 60s when they discontinued passenger service on the FEC.
Okay.
And so that leadership was in no way interested in even talking about the reinstitution of passenger service. So the study never had an opportunity to look at the FEC because they wouldn't allow it. So it just looked at the CSX corridor.
So if you're looking now and you're seeing the efforts that are going on with Broward County, Miami-Dade County, the MPOs, trying to get passenger rail back onto the FEC along with Brightline, do you see the positive impacts that you did with Tri-Rail as finally leading to that change of heart at the FEC as well?
Yeah, I'm glad you put it that way, Greg, because I do think it's a natural evolution. One of the, I think for the average person, the FEC corridor, because it goes through the downtowns, it in some ways appears more obvious, but as transportation professionals, what we know is that more people are actually traveling in terms of trips on 95.
Correct, yeah.
And so in terms of just getting the first service started, where Tri-Rail is today made a lot of sense because it was the corridor that had many people going up, moving in the corridor. But now that it's established and you want to try to see how can we expand this mobility option, the idea of adding to it now the FEC corridor makes sense.
When you were looking at it way back in the day, did you ever think about what type of east-west connectivity needed to be done for Tri-Rail to tap into other markets?
Yeah, that was the question about whether or not that east-west connectivity could be sort of a continuous service of the commuter trains, because there are connections, as you may know, in Pompano Beach, down in North Dade, up in West Palm Beach. There are connections between the two rail corridors. So you could take a look at trains that could operate on both corridors, as a single service. But the other part to that question, I think, Greg, is also, but is that connectivity something just beyond just the commuter rail? What about that first and last mile? So does connectivity mean not only from one rail corridor to another, but also to major destinations that might be in between?
And I think that's where we're looking together. I mean, you and I have been around for a long time, but if you look together and you look at where we're headed here in Southeast Florida, between the efforts Miami-Dade is doing to connect into Homestead with a rapid transit system, the efforts Broward are beginning to make to actually have a bunch of east-west corridors, whether they're bus rapid transit, buses operating in dedicated lanes, or even a light rail system. There's a lot of efforts to tie that. So that backbone, and this goes back to one of the, just to share with everybody, basically we provided an award to Joe a few months back, thanking him because of that innovation that is Tri-Rail and that beginning of that system, because that created a lot. But that said, so now all of a sudden we're here in today and we're looking at the future. From your perspective from the past, where are the corridors that you would recommend that they kind of look at? Just
maybe from a transportation with a little bit of looking at the community, I think, part of it is taking a look at where people are coming from and going to today. So, for example, taking a look at like the Nova Southeastern campus, which is, I think, the number 2 job center, or at least it was for a long time, in Broward County. So there seems to be like a no-brainer. Somehow, some better end lies not only on the I-595 corridor, but also on University Drive.
Right.
So there seems like that, for example, taking a look out west at Sunrise, where you have the arena, you have Sawgrass, and all the, and everything that's going on out there. So I think there are major hubs that you could take a look at around the county and say, we need to try to get, maybe that's the next step of higher frequency, higher capacity connections. And I'm saying this knowing that, Greg, the MPO's long-range plan identifies premium transit corridors, in the areas along what I just mentioned in transit hubs.
And 15 years ago, you and I got to work together on identifying a bunch of those corridors and hubs.
Yeah.
It was funny. This morning I was actually communicating with a former board chair from back then, and he saw that we're currently, just for everybody's knowledge, we're doing the 2050 plan. Mm-hmm. And back then it was a 2035. Yeah. And he goes, it seems like yesterday. And it was 15 years ago. Yeah. And it took a lot of efforts to get us where we are today, just to see maybe some of that planning come into reality. Yeah. So I asked the question really simply because it's like, I think as residents, and you and I are probably, you were born here. I wasn't, but I came here when I was 2.5. And, I've been here ever since. Planning on staying here forever. So I'm like looking at this going, okay, well, what's this future going to be like, for me getting old here? What's this future going to be like for my nieces and nephews' kids? Same thing, with your kids and their children and their children's children, and what type of legacy do we leave behind? So with that, we know what we did in the 2035, you and I do, but what corridors, this is now off, this is not the right. Joe Yesbeck, TYLin, this is Joe Yesbeck, Broward County resident.
Right.
What would you say?
So, I think that when we take a look at the corridors, Greg, there's two parts to that. And just to pat you and the MPO on the back, because number one is, the principal responsibility, what everyone thinks about is being able to be mobile and move distances between like major hubs or major commercial centers around the county. But for quality of life, for the residents, it's really about, just the more local mobility. And so some of the issues that you're doing with Safe Streets, some of the, and the programs you've put in place to help the cities and communities here to take a look at maybe like a downtown corridors in Pompano and Hollywood and Fort Lauderdale, where residents and visitors, they don't have to use a car. They can walk. They can bike. They can, and those types of investments and transitioning the corridors away from just a car corridor to really a full mobility corridor for people to be able to enjoy. I think that's what's going to be important, like for me,
right,
and hopefully for my kids and my grandkids, that transportation and mobility isn't going to be just about trying to go a long distance, but it's going to be also about moving around their own community.
Yeah, one of the things I noticed as I've gotten older, I actually moved closer into downtown Fort Lauderdale, so I could walk to the grocery store, so we could go walk to restaurants, so I could ride my bike a little bit better, because there's actually better facilities as you get closer to town than there are when you're further out. I think that's kind of a fascinating thing. That future is mobility, and it's localized mobility, because the distances were so geared in our brains to think we need to move people far. How do we get people into Miami? How do we get people up to Palm Beach? How do we get people to downtown Fort Lauderdale? And in our brains, that's what the functional side says, but it really is those local trips. It's that little short distance to go from your house to the coffee shop and back.
Right.
What an exciting conversation to have with you. I think, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but I'm going to ask if you can come back in the future. We can maybe see where we are with our planning efforts.
That would be great.
And, and have a few more conversations about what we thought was going to happen and where we're going to go.
That sounds wonderful. Thanks so much for the time to talk about the past, and also kind of where we're going in the future.
Because that's an important thing. Joe, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Greg.
The Let's Talk Transportation podcast is produced by the Broward MPO, where every day we fund and implement projects that move people and goods, create jobs, and strengthen communities. Learn more at browardmpo.org and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn at Speak Up Broward. If there is a transportation topic you'd like to know more about, let us know by sending an email to info@browardmpo.org.